Hello, everyone. I'm Randall Pinkston, and I am a resident of Teaneck and a big fan of the Teaneck International Film Festival. Welcome to tonight's film and to the talkback that we hope to hear from you with your questions throughout our conversation. But first, let me take a moment to recognize our major sponsors: the Puffin Foundation, New Jersey PBS, Teaneck Bergenfield Cinemas, Davis, Saperstein, and Solomon, the Teaneck Public Schools, the Township of Teaneck, the Jewish Standard, and Fairleigh Dickinson University. This program is made possible in part by a grant administered by the Bergen County Division of Historic and Cultural Affairs from funds granted by the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. Tonight's film was sponsored by the Bergen County, New Jersey chapter of the Links Incorporated, the Martin Luther King Birthday Committee, and the Jewish Community Council of Greater Teaneck. It is a pleasure to welcome the award-winning filmmaker, producer, writer, author Nancy Buirski to the Teaneck International Film Festival to discuss the film that you've just seen, A Crime on the Bayou. A Crime on the Bayou, of course, is the latest in a series of works that expose hidden stories of American history, including The Loving Story and The Rape of Recy Taylor. Ms. Buirski's awards include a Peabody and an Emmy for The Loving Story. And while much of her work focuses on race, she's also focused on the plight of migrants, as well as people with physical challenges, such as a ballerina who later contracted polio. And she's done a documentary about filmmaker Sidney Lumet. I could go on, but I won't, because we want to speak to you, Nancy Buirski, about the film we just watched, A Crime on the Bayou. First question: what brought this story to your attention? Why did you think this story needed to be told?
First of all, it's really good to be back at the Teaneck International Film Festival. This is my second visit to the festival. The last time was in person. And it's just a pleasure to be back. It's an honor to have the film shown here. This film was, I discovered it because there was a book that was being written about this story and other aspects of this story, what was going on in Louisiana in the 60s, by an author named Matthew Van Meter. The book was in proposal form, and coincidentally, Matthew and I have the same agent. His book agent is at ICM, and my film agent is at ICM. And so somehow they got us together. They told me about the book, and I read his proposal, and I thought, I don't know if I can do this, because I've already done The Loving Story and I made The Rape of Recy Taylor, and they deal with systemic racism. They deal with the law and how that impacts racism. It deals with so many, all these films have already dealt with what this story was about. And then one of my colleagues pointed out to me that if I did A Crime on the Bayou, which is my title, his book is called Deep Delta Justice, but if I did make this film, then I'd end up having a trilogy. So the trilogy was not intentional, but it seemed like the perfect way to bring all these stories together, because what they have in common, which was so important to me, was to shine a light on little known heroes of the civil rights era, people who did not set out to be activists, people who did not set out to change the world, but did so in the process of standing up for what was right. And I felt like, what an opportunity to shine a light on these people who were not well known. So that's what all three of these films actually do.
And not to mention that one of those people, well, two of them really ended up producing a landmark Supreme Court decision that has affected everyone on trial in Louisiana. In fact, everyone around the country who deserves a jury trial. But that's another story. Let me ask you this: the main characters, Gary Duncan and attorney Richard Sobel. Could you just, so we heard the story, we heard about the interplay between them, but what was your impression of those two heroic men?
Two more noble people I could not have come across. They're both Richard, as you know, has passed away, unfortunately, so he can't contribute to the conversation. But Gary Duncan often does conversations with us when he's available. When he's not out on fish, Gary is still trawling shrimp. He's a wonderful man, a friend, a good friend, a gentle friend, but he also, when I say but, and he very much stands up for what is right to this day. And so Gary hasn't changed. The man that fought for his rights with the support of his parents, by the way, with his family, the man who fought for his rights is the same person who would, if he could get out there and protest in the streets, he would do that. Richard Sobel was a little bit more reticent about doing the film than Gary was. But when I convinced him that this story needed to be told, he went along very happily, and he did see the film before he passed away, and he was very happy with it.
About Attorney Sobel, who had, as you point out in the film, had been working in Washington with in that big law firm where
now you're making me forget it.
Those guys.
Fortis Porter, and whatever the name is. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting it myself.
So Sobel initially went to Louisiana to, I guess, work on vacation for civil rights workers, right? Was that the initial?
It was typical starting in what they call the Freedom Summer, which is 65, for lawyers from the East Coast primarily, but basically lawyers that were not from the South, to go to the southern states to work on civil rights cases. Many of them joined a group called LCDC, the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, and they were assigned. So Richard Sobel was assigned to Louisiana. Initially, he was disappointed. He wanted to go to a state where he felt there'd be more action, as he put it, like Mississippi or Alabama. But when he got to Louisiana, he found there was more than enough action. And in fact, he was the rare attorney who didn't just go for his vacation, but he stayed.
And that was the question I wanted to ask. Did he ever think about going back? Was he married then? I mean, what prompted such a drastic move? I mean,
he believed in the work. He believed in the work. I mean, he did go back, and he stayed for long periods of time. So he just believed that he could accomplish a tremendous amount, and he was so committed, and his goals were to try to affect some change in that environment. And he knew he could do more there than he could at Arnold, Fortis, and Porter.
Okay, pedestrian question. How in the world did he manage to make a living doing civil rights in Louisiana, as opposed to working for that law firm in DC, which I'm sure paid a decent salary?
Right, exactly. I'm sure he made a much smaller salary. No question, he would be lucky if he got paid for whatever cases he was on. He was working, by the way, when you go to, he didn't have a license to practice in Louisiana. That certainly comes out in the film. So he teamed up with the Lois Eli's firm. And so he was an associate of that firm, and then gradually he left, and I suppose he did get a license, and he practiced on his own in Louisiana.
Could you let me just prompt our audience. If you have questions, please send them, and I will read them in chat as soon as I get them. It's interesting to me when I look at the film, the parallels, the historic parallels that were going on at the same time, as well as the parallels to, God forbid, current day events. And one of the parallels that occurs to me, first of all, is that Mr. Duncan gets arrested for touching the elbow of a white boy. Soon, not even 10 years after Emmett Till lost his life for allegedly saying something and possibly whistling, although I don't know if the whistling ever happened, or if he actually said anything, because there's still a lot of question about exactly what actually prompted him to be accused of. The
woman who accused him retracted her
allegation, right? But that parallelism, I'm sure you were aware of that. How did you deal with that in making that film?
Well, it's one of the main reasons I made it. I do believe that history teaches us so much. And when we are living through events like we've lived through in the last couple of years, I mean, obviously it's continued. There hasn't been a break in this kind of behavior, but we're much more conscious of it now, between Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and people who have been murdered in the last couple of years. It's very hard to not see the relationship. And I want people to understand that this didn't just start in the last 10 years, those of us who have short memories or are young and haven't been taught the history that they should have been taught. You know, unfortunately, our schools don't always, particularly in the South, don't always teach these stories. And so we as documentary filmmakers have an opportunity to remind people that these these events did not just begin yesterday, but they've been going on for a long, long time. And if we don't learn from them, we are destined to repeat this, for a long time. It's very tragic when you think about how long this has been going on.
Let me read something from, I think it's from David. Gary, a gentle friend who touched an elbow to move justice forward and became a soldier. Freedom Summers. Thank you to all those lawyers, many Jewish, who were allies. How do we continue to foster those same relationships with members of the Jewish and Black communities today?
It's a really good question because obviously Jews felt an alliance to Blacks during the struggle. And in the 60s, of course, it was only 20 years after the end of the Second World War. So the feelings were very fresh. The sensitivity towards what had happened during the Holocaust, we're further away from that now. So that makes this question extremely smart. What do we do now? I think we continue telling these stories and we encourage it. Allyship is a very important part of our story. Jews and others feel a connection to affecting change. And Angela Davis says in our film, I think very appropriately, that we all should feel a responsibility. Mm-hmm. It's not just people who are the obvious victims of racism, but in effect, we're all, I don't know if victim is the right word. I have to be very careful using language these days, but I think we're all affected by hate and racist behavior. The anti-Semitism in this country is so strong. Racism is still so strong. Whether or not you're a member of a group that is directly affected, you are affected because this lands on our shoulders. If we can't do something to change this, then we're all responsible. So I think that's all I can say is that we have to have these conversations. We have to show films like this in communities that and have these conversations as much as possible.
You referenced the fact that a lot of history isn't taught down south, and I will just say it's not taught all over the country. And now we even have a movement of some people in high places who want to, shall we say, eliminate certain historical information from being taught, or if it is taught, to give the quote unquote opposite opinion. And another parallelism occurs with a soundbite that you included in your film from the bigoted leader of Plaquemines Parish, Leander Perez, when he said, we are desegregating the schools would, quote, deprive white youth of educational opportunities. And today we have some people saying that teaching the truth about enslavement and the economic cost, the fact that enslaved people and their descendants were never paid, somehow will make white kids feel guilty. What do you say to people who have that perspective about the teaching of historical truths?
I don't think that we should be making white kids feel guilty, but I do think we should be making white kids feel responsible. I think there's a big difference. I think we should all feel responsible, and we have to keep having these conversations. I mean, I think that being in this talk back with you makes me feel I'm so grateful to my team and everybody who worked on this film, because there are times it's very, very hard work, and it's hard work to raise the money to do it. And it takes 2 or 3 years to get the film finished. But when we're having a conversation like this, and I recognize that it addresses exactly the problem that you're articulating, it makes me feel like it's all worth it. If a film like this can remind people of their responsibilities to address these issues and never take it for granted that it's going away, then we've done our job.
In a conversation that you had about another film that you made about Reese Taylor, you said that history doesn't end, that it's really about reality being reconsidered. Would you care to elaborate on that?
I think it's exactly what I said, that we're not talking about history and then current day. We're talking about a continuum. We're talking about things that started way before the 60s. I mean, Reese Taylor's assault and rape took place in the 40s in Alabama. But we're talking about going back to days of enslavement. We're talking about going back to the colonies. All of this is one long continuum where people feel they have a right to own other people. This is, if you look at Raoul Peck's incredible series on HBO called Exterminate All the Brutes, you'll be reminded that this goes back to the way, we settled this country. The way we treated indigenous people. There is a sense of entitlement on the part of some individuals that take advantage and do really serious harm to others. And we need to teach our kids when they're growing up at the youngest age about compassion, about values, about fairness. This has to start in the home. It doesn't matter what ethnic group you're from. This is all about having a sense of right and wrong and morality. I don't want to get on, I feel like I've just gotten on my, on a pulpit and I'm preaching, but I get wound up when I start thinking about how people forget these very basic truths and values. So I hope our film does help, communicate some of those things.
Well, before you leave the pulpit, may I, it does get me to another question that I wanted to pose at some point in this conversation. What is it that prompted you to focus on issues of race? I mean, you've done films about other issues. You could have done films about anything. What is it about this topic that resonates with you that prompted you to even tackle it in the first place?
I've thought long and hard about that, because there is a conversation today, and it's a very fair and important conversation about agency and who should tell these stories. Whether or not a white filmmaker like myself should be telling a story about a Black man like Gary Duncan or Reese Taylor or Mildred Loving. And, I've had to give that very serious thought, because I do appreciate the fact that it's taken a change in the industry to open up more real estate for African-American filmmakers. But that said, I hope that at some point that will level itself out and everybody will feel empowered to tell stories about people other than themselves, because that's a very exciting thing to do, to look at another human being or another group, and out of caring and out of curiosity and out of empathy, one wants to tell those stories. So that's one thing, I guess, that just happened naturally to me. But I did grow up in an environment where fairness was important, where I was taught the basic principles of right and wrong. And I have memories of, in my elementary school, standing up for someone who was being treated badly. I don't know where that came from, but it must have started in the home. And that's all I can tell you, that those are things that have always been important to me.
Where did you grow up?
In Interracial, New York. So, a very diverse, relatively large city, 45 minutes from Broadway, as George M. Cohen said. And I went to one high school. There was one high school in Interracial where everybody went. So, we had Italians and Blacks and Latinx and whites and, Presbyterian and Jews and all of that, it's a terrific mixture. And I think that also imbued me with a sense of fairness and a sense of, a comfort level in being in a diverse community. That was always very comfortable for me and something I was proud of.
By the way, I appreciate your candor and your answer. However, I was not trying to tiptoe around asking you about that agency question. I was really curious about whether there was a moment or an incident or something in your family's history, your father, or maybe in World War II, or something that had, or something you read that.
Yeah, and by the way, I was happy to introduce the subject because it's come up a lot. But well, first of all, one thing I am proud of is that we worked very hard to make sure that this movie was a movie in which Gary had a voice. It wasn't my voice, it was Gary's voice. And not only does Gary tell his own story, but he interprets his own story. He allows us to understand the meaning of his story. And of course, in addition to that, this film is also about a friendship between a Black man and a white man. So it's complicated. The whole issue of agency is very complicated, but I don't shy away from it myself because I think it's worth having the conversation. But I also appreciate the fact that you wanted to know where this came from personally. And I've been giving that a lot of thought. I'm not sure that I have a specific answer or one incident, but I'm grateful that I grew up in a home and also in a community where these things were issues and they were important. And so I was affected by it.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you recall whether Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee lived in New Rochelle?
I think they did.
Did you ever
no,
meet
I
them?
never met them. No.
Okay.
I wish.
Yeah. The other thing that I found, that resonated with me, one of the things, many of them, but Mr. Duncan makes a point of saying that it was his mother who made sure that he didn't take a plea, cop a plea and be done with it. That you didn't do this, you didn't do anything wrong, and so you stand up for your rights. And I also heard you talking about how important women, Black women, were to the foundation stone of the civil rights movement long before Martin Luther King Jr., before World War II. Talk to me about that through line, if you will, of your interest in making sure that women have agency.
Thank you for bringing that up. And of course, it's more in the film Rape of Recy Taylor that we see Black women organizing and becoming, as you say, the foundation for the Montgomery bus boycott. Even though Martin Luther King got a lot of publicity around that time because he was such a great spokesperson, and they were happy to share the stage with him and hand over that bully pulpit to him. But it was the Black women during that period and for decades before who would gather in churches. It's really, the through line is the women and the church community, because that's where they would gather and they would discuss and get energized and support each other and support someone like Recy Taylor. So, she got support from Rosa Parks, as you may remember from the film. And Rosa Parks was supported and embraced by the Black organization, these women that decided they were not going to ride the bus. If someone like Rosa Parks could not ride the bus where she thought she should be able to, they weren't going to either. We make it clear in that movie that it was those women who walked every day and did not ride the bus that really helped that boycott to succeed.
We have I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, that's it. That's it.
Deborah writes, how can we stop the terrible backsliding in civil rights happening today? This includes voter rights, laws aimed at various minorities, Blacks and other ethnicities and regions.
We have to gather as an organization, as groups, as communities. I don't have the magic bullet. I wish I did, because I'm as troubled about this as you are. We have to make sure we elect the right officials. And, it's ironic that it's voting rights that's being impinged on, when it's exactly, that's the tool that we need to make sure that we have the right people in Congress, and we elect the right president. I think we should be very worried about what's going to happen in the midterm elections. And I think we should be very worried about what's going to happen during the next, presidential election. And we need to be working on this now. So how do we stop it? I think it's usually by making sure the right people are in office, but it means gathering community, protesting when we have to protest, making sure that people's voices are heard. What really connects all these films, by the way, Randall, you mentioned, the film about the ballet dancer who was stricken with polio, and the film about Sidney Lumet, and these three films that deal with race and the law. It really is about people having, we've been talking about agency too. It's really about all of these people having agency. It's all about these people having a voice. When Tana Leclerc is stricken with polio, she finds her voice in a way that she hadn't when she was a dancer. Sidney Lumet finds his voice in the process of doing an interview with us about his work, and you see his own sense of morality come out in so many of his films, where people stand up against mob rule. There are people that, whether it's Serpico or 12 Angry Men, the lone juror in 12 Angry Men, or the policeman in Prince of the City, these are people that stand up to, unfairness and immorality, and often in the form of a mob. And this is one of the things that we have to remember. We can stand up. Gary Duncan stood up for himself. Recy Taylor spoke up for herself on the night that she was gang raped by 6 white boys. Mildred Loving stood up for herself by saying she was not going to be banished from Virginia for 25 years. And she writes to Robert Kennedy and gets him to enlist the ACLU.
Banished because she was married to a white man.
She was married to a white man. So I guess that it is so, we're talking about agency tonight. It's so much about people having agency, standing up for their rights, fighting back if they have been harmed, and getting out and voting, and make sure, and helping people who have trouble voting, helping them vote too.
You make the point that one person can make a difference. And of course, when that one person joins with others, that universal law of attraction for the benefit of others with no desire for benefit to themselves, that is the key to change, isn't it?
Yes.
And that I was listening earlier to, it was yesterday, right after the verdict in Wisconsin. And one of the commentators on the radio said, well, this is going to make people not want to go and vote, because they're going to figure, what difference does it make? The criminal justice system doesn't work. At least it works for some people, but doesn't work for what works for white folks, doesn't work for black folks, or doesn't work for white folks who've been trying to help black people. And so there's this anger, this disappointment, this despair. But what I hear you saying is,
don't despair. You can't back away. I mean, Obama said that for every one step forward, for every 2 steps forward, we take 1 step back. And I think we have to just deal with that reality, because life isn't always fair, but we have to keep fighting for what is fair. And we can't give up. We just, those of us who have this sense that we have to do something, we just have to get out. And the more people who do it, and the more people who stand up for what's right, the more things will change. It's going to take a long time, but things have changed. I mean, Armin Dürfner says at the end of our movie that, Black kids were murdered all the time back in the 60s. We just didn't know about it. And now we know about it, and it feels like things are much worse, but they aren't. They are getting better. It's gradual, and just don't get too discouraged. Just get out there and keep fighting for it, and teach your kids. I think that's where the change happens. It happens as, in generational. It's the young kids that have to make the difference. Not that people our age don't make a difference. We all do. We're making the movies. We're Randall, you're teaching. I'm sure you're making a big difference when you're teaching.
I'm trying.
But we have to make sure that these values are cultivated in the home.
Excuse me, my battery is running low. I forgot to plug in. Okay. I have a couple of questions waiting in chat, but I do want to ask you a little something about filmmaking. As I watched the documentary, I found myself holding my breath because I was worried that something horrible was going to happen to Mr. Duncan on one of his many arrests or his encounters with the cops, like that he would be beaten or that someone from his family would be harmed, or that something horrific, because we know that those kinds of things tend to, well, they have happened. So my question to you is, did you intentionally build in that tension, or am I just being, too much of a
No,
movie?
I mean, the tension was there with him. He was worried about it too. So, and as was Richard Sobel. I mean, remember Richard Sobel said he was scared to spend the night in jail, and he was a white man. But Gary Duncan was worried all the time. I mean, there was no guarantee that that wasn't going to happen. So I think you were responding to something that was very real. And believe me, he did spend numerous nights in jail. And it was, I mean, when he breaks down in that one scene where he says, "I'm not going back, they're going to have to kill me before I'm going to go back." This is a man that's just had it. He's broken at that point. And so fortunately, what you're describing did not happen. He wasn't lynched. He wasn't beaten up, but he was abused in an emotional way. And I think that we can't underestimate how serious that is. Lolis Eli says that for a Black person, doing anything becomes a political act. And he also reminded us that this kind of dictatorial, authoritarian, totalitarian state that they were living in meant that you never knew when you were going to cross the line. So that tension that you're feeling is the tension that I believe most Blacks were feeling in the 60s in Louisiana, because they didn't know when they would cross the line. I mean, you saw a cop there with a billy club, and it could have happened. The fact that Gary Duncan survived this is kind of a miracle when you think about it. And by the way, may I add that part of the reason that it's a miracle is that Richard Sobel and other people that helped Gary Duncan made an example of him. So it was harder for people to, Leander Perez made an example of Gary Duncan by arresting him. Richard Sobel made an example of that arrest and drew attention to it, partly to protect Gary Duncan. And then we made an example of this case by making this film.
Question from the audience. Do you think the Rittenhouse verdict will assist in reestablishing and fostering better relationships among those who fight for racial justice?
Better relationships. I'm not sure what that means. I know that everybody was very disappointed by the verdict. And I think that's, Obama's one step back. I think that it will generate, again, more activity and more conversation and discussion about systemic racism. I haven't quite decided what to make of it myself. I mean, it's a horrible situation, and I think it's a really bad verdict. And I think it's very disappointing for those of us who are fighting for fairness. But I do hope that this continues the conversation. I guess the answer is yes. I think it will continue the conversation.
Definitely will continue the conversation, and unfortunately kind of took a left turn with the discussion by some members of Congress who are talking about giving Rittenhouse a job as a congressional page.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, that was in the news today. Another question. Your opinion, what do you think would have happened if Mr. Duncan's case had been taken to the Roberts court as opposed to the Warren Court with
Mm.
respect to whether a state had the right to have its own rules with respect to people having a jury trial?
I wish I were a legal expert and an expert on the Supreme Court. It's a great question, and I'd like to leave it as a question. I think it actually is a better question than I could give an answer to. What would have happened if it had gone to the Roberts Court? That's a really good question.
I should have known this. I went to law school, but I had forgotten that there were some states that did not apply the same constitutional standards with respect to, I mean, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights guarantees everybody a trial, a jury of your peers.
Right.
But it really only applied to federal
That's right.
laws until this case from
Well,
little old Louisiana.
Yeah. Well, it's like interracial marriage. That was
Yeah.
also applied to federal, if in a federal situation, but it did not apply to every state. So when that Loving v. Virginia was heard in the Supreme Court in 1967, there were 22 states, I believe, that still did not allow for interracial marriage.
Mm.
And in the case of Louisiana, I don't know. I think Richard Sobel chose to make an example of that. It gave him the right to appeal. This is a way of keeping Gary Duncan out of prison, because it wasn't just going to jail. He had lost that case and he would have gone to prison for a year. So Richard Sobel was looking for a way to appeal this. And that was his appeal. Now, ironically, having a trial by jury does not necessarily guarantee fairness. Particularly in the South in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was very hard to find a jury of your peers if you're a Black man. So, but Richard Sobel very smartly realized that he could appeal this, and he did, and it finally went to the Supreme Court. So I don't know the answer. What would happen if this were in front of a Roberts Supreme Court? But Richard Sobel was a very clever 29-year-old man who spoke in front of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and he had the good fortune of opposing counsel from the state of Louisiana who wasn't exactly having a good day.
No, she wasn't.
From an anonymous viewer, has this documentary been shown to the citizens in Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana?
It has been shown. It was shown at the actually one of our first festivals was the New Orleans International Film Festival. Mm-hmm. And so I assumed that a lot of people from Plaquemines Parish came to it. We certainly made sure that they knew about it. We haven't had a special showing in Plaquemines Parish. There were as many people from New Orleans that were involved in that case as Plaquemines Parish, of course. It is now on Stars, by the way. People can see it on Stars. They can look at it in a number of other venues. So anybody can see this film at this point.
I'm sure you recorded many more hours of material than were distilled into the documentary. And as a producer, as a director, you have to make decisions about what goes in, what comes out. I'm wondering, as you think back on it, what if you go back and make your documentary, I don't know, 15 to 20 minutes longer, what are some things that you left on the cutting room floor that you would want to have included?
You're going to find this unusual answer, but I would say nothing. Okay. There was yes, there was more interview material. There was certainly more B-roll shot in Louisiana, some of it quite beautiful. But I feel very strongly that documentaries, the documentaries that I make, should have a sense of storytelling, that they should have a beginning, middle, and end, and that you should feel like it starts off like it was a dark and stormy night, and this is what happened. And then this is what happened. And then this is how it got resolved. And those that go past that, and this is personal, by the way, I'm not saying every documentary should do documentary filmmaker should do what I do. And by the way, I don't do this alone. I have a wonderful editor named Anthony Rapoli. I have wonderful producers, Susan Margolin and Claire Chandler. Rex Miller was the cinematographer on this. I want to give a shout out to so many people that helped us. And if you go to our website, augustafilms.com, you'll see other people who deserve credit, a lot of executive producers that contributed to this. So I think they agree with me that sometimes, I would not say less is more because we don't want to leave out important material, but that telling the story in the way we tell it it brings you into it emotionally. And that includes the music we use. So that, when we go out of our way to make this feel cinematic, to make it feel like a story and not just information that we're feeding you, that people will get more, they'll get more caught up in it, and they will remember it. It's an important part of making these films, by the way. And by the way, speaking of music, the music at the end of the film, I want to give a shout out to Raphael Sadiq, who wrote an original song, My Path.
Wow, beautiful. And you talk about making a cinematic and scenes or moments that stay with you, and the whole film stays with you. But of course, at the end, when Attorney Sobel was apparently ill, or certainly not as healthy as he had been, and was putting off a visit from Mr. Duncan, and Mr. Duncan, with his, straight ahead kind of attitude, said, "Oh, heck to the no, I'm going to come see you." And that beautiful shot of them, it's just, oh,
I know.
Yeah, that was wonderful. That was wonderful. Is there, as we come to the close of our conversation, this is the kind of question that reporters, and I was a reporter for a number of years, but I always save this question for last. Is there anything that you want to tell me that I haven't asked you?
No, you've been great. I mean, people often say, what do you want people to take away from this film? And all three films have a similar takeaway, I think, and that is that anyone can change history. That anybody, again, going back to why I made this film, why I pulled a team together to make this film, and it's so important to remind all of us that we can make a difference, that we don't have to be politicians, that we don't have to be activists, that we don't have to be filmmakers or writing books. We just have to stand up for what we believe in. And if that means going to the streets and protesting, that's fine. If nothing else, if it means voting and making sure one votes, and making sure your neighbor who can't get to the polls or hasn't figured out how to vote with an absentee ballot, because things get complicated for people that may have a disability or whatever, that's where you can make a difference. And that's what I hope we'll take away from this.
You mentioned your team, and I noticed in looking at the credits that in addition to directing and writing and producing, you also did some camera work.
Yeah.
A one-woman band, as we.
No. I mean, honestly, I could not have made this film without that team. The little bit of camera work I did was because we were at that wonderful crayfish dinner at the end of the film, and we had an extra camera, and I said, "Oh, I'm dying to shoot this." So I picked it up and I shot, because I was originally, I came into filmmaking from being a photographer. And so I do like, I do like having my eyes behind the camera, whether it's still photography or shooting. And so it gave me an opportunity to shoot a little bit of that dinner. And then when that was over, we ate some crayfish.
I said it was the last question, but you just made me think of something. So at one point in your career, you were an editor for the New York Times.
A photo editor.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you did a book of photography about migrant workers as well, right?
Yeah, it's called Earth Angels, and it's called Earth Angels, Migrant Children in America. And I did it actually while I was at the New York Times. I took days off and my vacation time and all of that. I really wanted to see what it was like for the families where children were doing so much of the stoop labor in this country. We tend to forget how much of our vegetables and fruit come from that process we call stoop labor. And that's because people have to stoop down to pick and harvest. And many of those people tend to be children in spite of labor laws. But those children actually taught me a big lesson, and that was that they felt very valued by the work they were doing. So the book became more complicated than I expected it to. I thought I was going to be, a scold and saying we shouldn't have children working in the fields. And I realized that's the answer is not that simple. So that book is, I think it's available online, Earth Angels, Migrant Children in America.
And where did you shoot it?
I shot in upstate New York, in Florida, in Texas, in Washington, and in California. So these are mostly migrant laborers that came mostly from Mexico, and followed the migrant harvest. They migrated with the harvest.
I am just so appreciative to you for taking the time to join us and to share your insights about the wonderful work that you do, and to encourage all of us to do our part, whatever part it is that we can do. So I want to thank you again, Nancy, for being with us, and also a big tip of the hat to all of our sponsors, especially my friends with the Links and Martin Luther King Celebration Committee. I've worked with them in the past, so I'm a special tip of the hat to them, and to the town of Teaneck, where I live and pay taxes. Thank you very much. So we're just thankful. Now, I know you're working on another project. Can you tell me what it is?
Yeah,
yes, go ahead.
And before I go to that other project, I also would like to suggest, if people want to have a further conversation about this or learn any more about the film, that we have a Facebook page called A Crime on the Bayou. And we also have a website, which is augustafilms.com, Twitter and Instagram. Instagram is Augusta Films. So please join us and follow us. We'd love to continue these conversations.
Augusta as in Augusta, Georgia. Augusta as in Augusta, Georgia.
It's not Augusta, Georgia, but it's called Augusta Films, but it's like the word Augusta.
Okay.
Yes, I'm working on a very exciting project. There was a book that came out recently on the making of the film Midnight Cowboy. I don't know how many people who are watching tonight saw that film. It came out in 1969, but it was a cultural inflection point for many people. It was a touchstone. It was a film that people remember. When I mention the film, they tell me that, yes, they saw it, and they can even remember where they saw it and what they were wearing. It seemed to have changed people's lives. And it also was an inflection point for the type of filmmaking that changed after that film. So there's a lot to look at. It's the era of Midnight Cowboy. It's not the making of Midnight Cowboy. And the book, by the way, is by Glenn Frankel, if anyone's interested in the book, called Shooting Midnight Cowboy. But my film will not be the shooting of Midnight Cowboy. It will be the era and the moment of Midnight Cowboy.
Gotcha. Thank you again, Nancy Buirski, for being with us on the Teaneck International Film Festival Talkback. And with that, let me leave our audience with this word. Tomorrow night's film, the last one of this year's film festival, is Storm Lake. It is a free screening, but you do need a reservation or an all-access pass. Tickets are available at the usual place, www.teaneckfilmfestival.org, www.teaneckfilmfestival.org. And finally, we want to remind you that the Teaneck International Film Festival is only possible because of you, our audience. So please do consider making a tax-deductible donation to TIFF by clicking the donate button at the top of your screen. And with that, I bid you all a good night and a good weekend. Thanks again, Nancy.
Thank you, Randall.